On a crowded New York subway, as city lights blurred by the windows, a young mother gave up her seat for an elderly black veteran. Little did she know that her small act of kindness was about to change her life forever. But as he looked up with tired, grateful eyes, she noticed something strange, a detail that stopped her in her tracks, sending chills down her spine. What she didn't know yet was that this man's story went far beyond the ordinary. And the revelation of his true identity would leave her speechless and captivate an entire city. It was rush hour on a chilly November afternoon, and the New York City subway was packed as usual. Jessica Whitman, a 32-year-old mother of two, was commuting back home after a long day of work at her office in Midtown. Clutching a shopping bag in one hand and balancing her toddler in the other, she scanned the car, hoping for a rare empty seat. It had been one of those grueling days at work, and she was exhausted. The thought of standing for the 30-minute ride felt daunting. But as she moved toward a corner to steady herself, her eyes caught sight of an elderly man standing by the door. He had broad shoulders, though slightly hunched, and wore a weathered military jacket decorated with patches and medals, each representing battles fought and sacrifices made. His dark, weathered skin hinted at the years he'd endured and the challenges he'd faced, but his gaze was calm, almost resigned, as though he had learned to expect little from those around him. Something inside Jessica stirred. She saw herself in him, tired, resilient, quietly enduring the burdens life placed on them. She felt a pang of sadness that a man his age, a veteran no less, was left standing while younger, able-bodied passengers filled the seats around him, preoccupied with their own lives. Without a second thought, Jessica gently tapped the shoulder of the person sitting nearest to her and motioned toward the man. "Sir," she called to him, "please take my seat." She offered him a warm smile, her own exhaustion fading as she focused on his comfort. The man looked up, surprise evident in his dark, steady gaze. He hesitated, as if debating whether to accept, then nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, young lady. That's very kind of you," he said, settling into the seat with a quiet sigh of relief. Jessica stood beside him, gripping the overhead railing to steady herself. Her toddler squirmed in her arms, reaching out curiously toward the man's medals. He chuckled softly, his eyes lighting up as he let the child touch one of the medals. "That one," he murmured, his voice deep and rich, "is for bravery. For keeping a promise to protect others, even when it was hard." She noticed how gently he spoke to her son, as if he knew the weight those medals carried could be overwhelming for a young mind. She was struck by the contrast between his hardened exterior and the gentleness of his voice, a voice that had likely seen both horrors and hope. After a few moments, the man introduced himself as Lawrence Miller. "I served in the U.S. Army during Vietnam," he said, his gaze distant, as if seeing memories come alive before him. Jessica, listening intently, noticed the subtle tremor in his voice, a tone that hinted at the toll war had taken on him. Lawrence explained how he had left for the war in his 20s, full of ideals and patriotism, ready to serve his country. But upon his return, he faced a nation that didn't fully welcome him back. He spoke about the sacrifices he'd made, his friends who hadn't made it home, and the struggle to adjust to a society that often seemed indifferent. "We came back as ghosts, in a way," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "People had moved on, and we were left to find our way back into a world that didn't recognize us anymore." Jessica's heart ached as she listened. Here was a man who had given everything for his country, who had walked through the darkest valleys, only to return to a world that barely acknowledged his existence. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and sadness for him and the countless veterans like him. In that moment, Jessica realized that her small gesture of kindness was perhaps the first acknowledgement he'd received in a long time. Her toddler, still fascinated by Lawrence, reached for another medal. Lawrence chuckled again, patting the boy's hand gently. "This one's for loyalty," he said softly. "For sticking with those you care about, no matter what." As the subway continued on its route, Jessica noticed a few passengers glancing at Lawrence with curiosity. Whispers began to circulate, and she caught fragments of conversations around her. "Is that really him?" one passenger murmured to another. A young man seated across the car pulled out his phone and began typing furiously, his gaze fixed on Lawrence. Jessica's curiosity was piqued. She leaned over to a middle-aged woman beside her, lowering her voice. "Excuse me, but do you know who he is?" The woman's eyes widened, and she looked at Jessica as if she couldn't believe she didn't recognize him. "You don't know," she whispered. "That's Lawrence Miller. He's practically a legend among veterans. He survived one of the most brutal POW camps in Vietnam. Some people thought he'd never make it back. Jessica's breath caught. Lawrence Miller. The name sounded familiar, echoing like a distant memory. Her mother had once told her stories of a brave soldier named Lawrence Miller, a man who had endured unthinkable horrors during the war and returned as a symbol of resilience and courage. And here he was, sitting beside her, a humble man who had quietly blended into the crowd. Jessica was nearing her stop, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. She was drawn to this man, captivated by his story and the quiet strength that radiated from him. She had to know more. "Mr. Miller," she said softly, "I had no idea. I don't know what to say. You've been through so much." Lawrence gave a modest shrug, his eyes focused on something far away. "Not much to say, really. I'm just grateful I made it home. Not everyone did." They exited the subway together, and as they stepped onto the platform, the crowd around them seemed to grow. People had taken notice of Lawrence. Some approached him, expressing their gratitude, while others discreetly snapped photos or shared stories of family members who had served in Vietnam. The subway platform had transformed into a quiet homage to a man who had once lived in the shadows. Then a tall, distinguished man in a dark suit approached, exuding an air of respect and authority. He introduced himself as Colonel Davis, a retired Army officer who had known Lawrence during the war. "Mr. Miller," he said, extending his hand, "it's been far too long." Lawrence took his hand, and Jessica watched as the two men exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They were bound by an unspoken understanding, by memories they could never fully share with anyone else. Jessica listened as Colonel Davis recounted a mission Lawrence had led in Vietnam, a mission that had gone horribly wrong, leaving Lawrence and his comrades captured. Lawrence endured nearly 2 years in a brutal POW camp, surviving only through sheer willpower and an unwavering hope for freedom. "Most people don't know," Davis explained, "but Lawrence, he had a clearance. He was part of a special operation, a unit designed for missions too dangerous for anyone else. When he returned, it was like a miracle. The things he went through, well, I can't even begin to imagine." Jessica felt her heart pound as the colonel spoke. Lawrence Miller wasn't just a soldier, he was a hero in the truest sense. His journey had been one of unimaginable courage, resilience, and sacrifice. She could barely contain her emotions as the gravity of his story sunk in. As more people gathered around, Jessica observed the reactions on their faces: admiration, gratitude, and above all, respect. Strangers approached him to shake his hand, express their appreciation, and share stories of loved ones who had served. The crowd reflected a collective sense of gratitude, a testament to the impact of one man's quiet resilience. Jessica reached out, her voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Miller, I hope you know how much you mean to us. Thank you for your service. And thank you for everything." Lawrence nodded, a rare hint of vulnerability showing through. "Thank you, Jessica. And thank you for seeing me. Not everyone does." In the days that followed, Jessica shared the story with her family and friends, and soon it made its way through local circles. Word of Lawrence's courage and sacrifice spread, igniting a movement of gratitude toward veterans across the city. The people of New York, who often moved past each other with little more than a nod, found a shared purpose in honoring the sacrifices of those who walked among them, hidden in plain sight. And for Jessica, that encounter became more than just a fleeting subway moment. It was a lifelong reminder of the impact of kindness and the unseen battles others endure every day. If this story moved you, if you believe in equality, and if you stand for honoring those who have sacrificed so much for us, don't just leave. Hit that subscribe button to hear more powerful stories that shine a light on the heroes hidden among us. And don't forget to drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Are you with us in standing for respect and equal treatment for all? Let's hear your voice. Together, let's make sure every hero's story is heard.